Over 165 million people have been affected by the lockdowns in China. Here's what you need to know about China getting stuck in a never-ending lockdown. Before we start, please like and subscribe to this channel and then sit back and relax. Lockdowns have been implemented in China's two biggest cities, Beijing and Shanghai, the economic backbones of the country, in an unwavering effort to contain the COVID-19 epidemic. With more than 10,000 new cases reported each day, Shanghai is the origin of the most recent outbreak. Authorities have responded with a citywide lockdown that has lasted for weeks, locking up nearly all of the 25 million residents of the once bustling financial center in their homes or neighborhoods. To stop the spread of diseases, Beijing officials have closed schools, started a mass testing program, and implemented special lockdowns in certain residential buildings. These steps have sparked worries about a wider lockdown like Shanghai. China has maintained a rigid zero-COVID policy throughout the pandemic, using lockdowns, mass testing, quarantines, and border closures to surpass the virus. But the arrival of the highly infectious Omicron variant has called into question the sustainability of that strategy. As the virus spreads to different cities and provinces faster than the government can contain it, authorities are now enforcing full or partial lockdowns in at least 27 cities across the country, with these restrictions affecting up to 165 million people, according to CNN estimates. Was the radical confinement of the population to end COVID positive? After almost 3 years of the restriction policies associated with zero COVID in China, the government led by Xi Jinping has abruptly cancelled its strategy. Yet, this modification is not accompanied by adequate defenses against an impending exponential rise in infections. The Asia giant lacks effective measures to deal with an exponential increase in infections, which could unleash the bigger health crisis to date in the nation. What awaits China after the end of COVID-0? Chinese President Xi Jinping has decided to abruptly end almost 3 years of his policy of draconian restrictions against the coronavirus pandemic called COVID-0, despite lacking effective measures to deal with an exponential increase in infections. This opens up a series of questions whose answer is not only important for the Chinese population but also for the rest of the planet. Do the catastrophic forecasts of deaths hold? Will China create a non-Western model to deal with the catastrophe? Will it develop its messenger RNA vaccine or be forced to import it? Until now, the strategy of confinement and strict and massive tests had kept infections and deaths at bay in the second economic power. Of a global count of 650 million infections and 6.6 million deaths, China has only registered 1.8 million cases and 5,235 deaths, according to official Chinese data, of doubtful credibility among observers due to the authoritarian and censorious nature of the regime. But at the same time, it has also seriously damaged the economy of the second economic power and the supposed Confucian patience of its population. At the end of November, civil wariness over the measures which have made the Chinese de facto prisoners of the pandemic sparked unusual protests in the country's main cities. During the marches, some even called for the resignations of Xi and the Communist Party of China, which has led the country since 1949. Experts have called it the World Cup effect, since many Chinese realized their sad situations when they verified that the public in the stadiums of the World Cup in Qatar was not wearing masks, a detail that at first slipped through the usual strict Chinese censorship. The measures were announced on December 7, immediately after the protests. These include a relaxation of daily PCR tests for mild cases, a reduction in digital exposure control of the population, allowing quarantines to be carried out in homes instead of the improvised facilities used until now, the restriction of confinements massive, and an increase in vaccinations for the elderly. However, they do not specify how they will deal with the highly predictable increase in infections, which could cause at least 1.55 million deaths, according to various publications in the journal Nature. Many observers have expressed their astonishment at Beijing's lack of preparations over the last 3 years, which could have been used to increase its intensive care capacity and create its mRNA vaccine, favoring a positive transitions at the end of COVID-0. China had 3.6 ICUs per 1,000 inhabitants at the start of the pandemic, half the ratio of Hong Kong, when the death piled up in that territory, a figure that has barely increased. As for the Chinese vaccines, developed by Sinovac and Sinopharm from inactivated viruses, their effectiveness with 3 doses is between 50% and 60% against the virus, compared with more than 90% with 2 doses of the vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna developed with mRNA. Based on these data, Airfinity, a health analytics firm, estimates that less than 10% of the population in China has protection against infection with the Omicron variant. The main urgency now is to vaccinate the elderly, the most vulnerable population, since 65.8% of those over 80 years of age have a dose of the Chinese vaccine and only 40% have received a 3rd dose. In addition, this sector of the population resists vaccinations for fear of its side effects. Sources from the sector have leaked that the Chinese authorities have been negotiating with Pfizer and Moderna to import their vaccine, which would be the most effective way to stop the catastrophe. But Beijing demands a transfer of technology and production of the vaccine in Chinese territory along that these multinationals refuse. The mRNA preparations have made a profit of $50,000 million. At the moment, both the United States and Germany have already recommended that Beijing import them to avoid a new pandemic tsunami originating in China. Joan Kaufman, professor of global health at Harvard Medical School, believes that Beijing will not import these vaccines. China will use its vaccines, Sinopharm or Sinovac, for its vaccination campaigns. The professor doubts they are going to import the mRNA ones from Pfizer or Moderna. According to her, China is developing its vaccine and it is in the testing process. She also considers that both the mRNA vaccines and the antiviral Paxlovid should be global health assets and not the intellectual property of their creators. It's sure that China, which has a very sophisticated research community, has reasons for not having launched its vaccine already. But surely, one of the reasons is the fight for intellectual property rights. And Moderna and Pfizer fear losing the enormous benefits that their new technology provides them and pressure China from the WTO to respect their IPR. There are mechanisms in the WTO such as TRIPS to access these patents in cases of health emergencies, as has already happened with AIDS. Why this agreement has not been invoked during the COVID-19 crisis is something that is beyond experts' knowledge. The top priority now is to reinforce vaccination of the population over 65 years of age, especially those over 80. The current Omicron variant is highly contagious but less virulent, although new variants may emerge. So, for the majority of the populations under 65 who have at least 2 doses of Sinovac or Sinopharm, it's not sure we are going to see a large number of serious illness and deaths. But the protection drops after 6 months, so a reinforcement campaign is important, and this is the plan. Protection of between 50% and 60% with 3 doses of these brands is not little, and it is quite good for a vaccine. The problem is among the elderly, especially those over 80 who have not had the 3 doses. There are many other medical conditions in this sector of the population in China, which has become a country with a great burden of preventable diseases such as diabetes and hypertension, and therefore disease and death among the elderly, whose number has grown very rapidly due to a longer life expectancy and the one-child policy. The situations could aggravate and also distort the number of deaths from COVID among this stratum. Unlike other experts, Kaufman believes that the measures announced by Beijing in the last week may be enough to contain waves of serious cases and deaths. But she is concerned about the fragility of the health system in the self-proclaimed communist country. There is no outpatient service system in China. People go to hospitals directly, often for minor ailments. This leads to a fear that hospitals will be overwhelmed. This is a real problem. But if the less serious cases isolate themselves at home, which should be encouraged, the system may not collapse. For now, the official Chinese media, which in April warned about the high lethality Omicron, have already proclaimed victory over COVID, which they now describe as little more than a bearable flu, a sign that propaganda and censorship will continue to do their job. Another symptom of this trend is the promotions of the supposed benefits of TCM against infection, an illusory effect already resorted during the 2003 SARS epidemic. Meanwhile, social networks are already reporting a drastic increase in infections in Beijing and Wuhan and unverified protests by personnel hired to apply the zero-COVID policy in the face of losing their jobs. But the numbers don't add up. A former manager of the China Center for Disease Control and Prevention, Feng Zijian, has stated that 60% of the populations will be infected by COVID after the relaxation of the measures. This would be 840 million people compared to the 646 million who have been infected so far worldwide, says global health expert Yan Chonghuang on his Twitter account. If the fatality of COVID is around 1%, do your numbers. The end of COVID-0 also raises another important question. Have the protests in China succeeded? Partially, it can be said that Beijing has heard the message, no more restrictions. But he is applying a strong hand so that the examples does not spread and the Chinese are enthusiastic about taking to the streets. The protests have dissipated after a massive police deployment and the high number of arrests and intimidation has unleashed panic among the protesters, subjected to relentless digital surveillance by the regime, and the point of skyrocketing requests for political asylum in the United States from an average of 25 per day to 250. Another sign of continuing civil unrest would have been to take advantage of Jiang Cheming's recent funeral to extol the dead leader as a criticism of the living one, a Chinese tradition that predates the Tiananmen protests in 1989. Not only have they not occurred, but the tribute has been the opportunity for former President Hu Jintao to publicly reappear after his embarrassing expulsion by order of Xi Jinping from the CPC Congress in October. Is Uncle Xi going soft? What can be the new scenario? The government's attempts to severely restrict the spread of the virus have failed due to the collateral damage to the Chinese economy and the social protests that were registered at the end of November by many inhabitants that could no longer stand the strict confinement policies imposed by the government. In December 2022, it was announced that the requirement to perform PCR tests in the mild cases would end. Population controls were also loosened. Home quarantines were permitted, mass confinements were prohibited, and elderly people received more vaccinations. According to the journal Nature, if the strategy for dealing with COVID-19 changes, it could result in at least 1.55 million deaths, with half of those deaths happening in the United States, which has already reported the highest number of deaths during the pandemic. The report also suggests that there would be a peak demand for intensive care units that would exceed the country's capacity by more than 15 times. A study from Fudan University predicts that abandoning the zero-COVID strategy could lead to over 112 million symptomatic cases and almost 5 million hospitalizations. Feng Zijian, former director of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention of China, estimates that around 60% of the population could get infected after relaxing measures, and the scale of the problem is significant, with 840 million people in China compared to 646 million infected worldwide. The University of Seattle predicts that 1.6 million people in China could die from COVID-19 over the next year, with 500,000 dying by April, but maintaining masks, implementing some movement restrictions, using new antiviral treatments, and increasing vaccinations could reduce these figures by just over half. What is the current state of the pandemic in China? The World Health Organization has reported that Chinese hospitals are becoming overwhelmed with new cases of COVID-19 and a new wave of infections, as per the BBC. Although only 7 deaths have been officially recorded as caused by COVID-19 as of December 21, 2022, and none in the previous 2 weeks, it is important to note that China has strict criteria for confirming deaths caused by the virus, which includes only those who died directly from infections caused by the virus and not deaths caused by its side effects. As a result, the number of deaths reported in China is much lower than in many other countries and does not match the WHO's guidelines. While official figures show a decrease in the total number of new infections in China in the week ending December 11, it's worth noting that mass testing has stopped. and only symptomatic patients receiving treatment in hospitals and clinics are being recorded. The lack of transparency in the information from China makes it challenging to estimate the extent of the current COVID-19 problem with certainty. What efforts did other governments put? To eliminate COVID-19 outbreaks, the Chinese government and other countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore implemented zero-COVID policies, which included strict border controls and extreme containment measures such as radical confinement. These policies led to significant success in the early stages of the pandemic, as evidenced by lower mortality rates compared to countries that did not implement such measures. However, governments outside of China proposed alternative approaches to dealing with the pandemic after the initial phase of strict confinement, which was deemed unsustainable in the long term due to social and economic reasons. The emergence of the highly transmissible Omicron variant highlighted the fact that the virus could not be contained indefinitely, and the zero-COVID approach recognized that it was a temporary solution until effective and widespread vaccination programs were available, particularly for vulnerable populations. As a result, countries that adopted zero-COVID policies gradually relaxed their restrictions as access to vaccines became more widespread. In contrast, China continued with its extremely restrictive health policy and insufficient vaccination rates, especially among vulnerable populations. At first, China's vaccination program was limited to individuals between 19 to 60 years of age, resulting in only 40% of Chinese citizens over 80 receiving a booster dose. The vaccines currently used in China are produced domestically by companies such as Sinopharm and Sinovac, which have a limited efficacy. Following a third dose, these vaccines are only 50 to 60% effective, whereas Pfizer and Moderna's mRNA vaccines achieve over 90% immunity with 2 doses. China's health policies have prioritized case detection and isolation, leading to an overwhelmed healthcare system, particularly in intensive care, where there are only 3.6 intensive care beds per 100,000 inhabitants, a figure nearly 3 times lower than Spain's. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, the subscription button, and the notification bell. To get notified when new videos are uploaded from this channel, please share your thoughts about how China got stuck in a never-ending lockdown in the comment section below. Thank you.